So let's just look at a few of these. Are some of the formalized worldview perspectives that James Sire introduces in his resource, and I don't want to go to great length on a lot of the points here, because I think if you're going to interact with some of this material, it would be best through reading. But I'd like to just mention a couple of things here that affect us probably, and I know that may be, you can't even, I just put up a point and you don't even know what it is now. That's the secret one there. But no, but some of these, they will be ways that we as societies look at life, and then that peoples that we're engaging with look at life, for sure. And so Christian theism, what James Sire does is, in his book, The Universe Next Door, is he presents kind of the formalized systems like this that we can look at and think about as worldview grids, interpretive grids for life. And I think it is helpful. Not only is it helpful, it's westernized in a sense and kind of formal categories, but also sort of traces the philosophical development of these areas of thought over time, the ways that the thought has continued to change and evolve in Western society. And I don't use evolve in any kind of a scientific sense, but I'm not an evolutionist per se. So, but the ways that thought has changed over time, and then he includes, in a recent edition, he included Islamic theism, which is one some of you can sort of see, and then the ones in the back you can see it, because it's affecting our lives quite a lot these days. It's certainly for us in the U.S., and I know even here that there are ways in which Australian government has made decisions in relationship to that coalition of forces that have probably affected your lives adversely somehow in Islamic theism. So again, I don't want to go through all of the formal categories there. We'll just mention a few, but he lists 7 primary questions, and I find myself referencing these questions as I interact with people from other cultural backgrounds, because ultimately I think these are questions that are commonly asked as people from other worldview backgrounds interpret life. So there's an origin point for reality for all groups of people, and in our naturalistic mindset, when you watch television, I heard them talking just today about the exploration of Pluto, because the NASA spacecraft or whatever is identifying characteristics of Pluto for the first time there, and they're seeing landforms that they didn't expect, mountains and flatlands, and they're predicting that there's probably some sort of hot heat-generating core to Pluto that they didn't anticipate would be the case. And so as they're describing origin points for the universe that might not be the ones they would have expected, which is what they were saying, wow, this could mean that the universe didn't originate in the way that we expected. I'm anticipating, so maybe they'll start to gradually progress their way back towards a theistic worldview somehow. And yet, the origin point for reality excludes those possibilities, right? So prime reality for those naturalists who are describing that phenomenon is, so the millions of years and billions of years that have played out, they haven't played out in quite the same way as we expected. And so their origin point closes the box to the possibility of that supernatural influence. And people groups around the world and people groups here do describe the origin point for reality, the definition of what's really real, what's prime reality. They often define that in unique ways. In the Yanomamo culture, and I know it's fairly uncommon in relationship to some of the cultures that we experience, but they had that set of stories that really define origin points for reality. And I always would find myself asking the question, so there were these pre-ancestors who became animals. So there was a story for every animal, like the alligator had once been a man, and his wife was the little frog that is, sorry ladies, she was a little frog that's now in the river that was the annoying voice at the time to the alligator because he gave fire to some people and he wasn't supposed to do that. So they have all those stories about ancestors who became animals, and in my kind of way of thinking about life, there still needs to be another starting point before that one. That starting point, even though that's the definition of the origin point for reality for them, it's still not far enough back. It doesn't take us actually to the real origin point. And that became an area where we could talk together about their view of life ultimately. That we could talk about the fact that there needed to be some sense of prime reality, something really real, that would be defined as a true origin point, even if you were going to describe ancestors who evolved into animals, which we wouldn't have accepted. But where did those ancestors come from? And those were kinds of questions that they didn't ultimately know how to answer. And so telling God's story and seeing Him as a pre-existent one who created all things ultimately became a story, a definition of reality that was more plausible even for them in their situation. And so that people are asking that question, and the naturalistic system that's so common nowadays that defines the material universe as the origin of reality, there are a lot of questions that get left hanging in midair in relationship to that. And, I've thought about there are lots of resources that we could try to talk about that are apologetics resources, and there's probably some value to those. I think ultimately, though, when you come back to this kind of question, you're talking about, are you willing to accept the possibility or the idea that there's an origin point for reality that's different than the one that you're holding to? So we could debate apologetically all day long, but unless we can talk about that kind of prime reality, then we're basically wasting our time, because that becomes a question that all these other questions hinge on as we think about worldview systems. And so I think what we would like to do is, in the process of hearing people's stories told in the communities around us, we want to understand how their story manifests a definition for reality, and how it manifests this second question as well. What's the cause of this external reality around us? The question of what a human being is. We saw the pictures of the monkey and the person, and both of them are posed like they're thinking, but and most people instinctively would say that's not the same kind of thinking. Even the naturalists would say they're not thinking about the same things at the same level of depth. The profoundness of thinking isn't quite the same. And so what is a human being? What makes a human being unique? How does the prime reality that you define create for the possibility of uniqueness in human identity? And the benefit of our worldview framework as Christian theists is that we can line up these points of reference in such a way that I feel like they're consistent. Whereas the majority of these other starting points create systems that there are gaps in definitions of humanity and a description of what happens to a person at death. Why is it possible for us to even know anything at all? How did we get from an animal that wouldn't actually know anything to a human being that can store information and contemplate information in an abstract way, and think about existence, think about worldview, have this kind of a conversation? We could have several dogs up here, and they would be unable to carry on this conversation right now, and as hard as we tried, right? So, why is it possible to know anything at all is one of the questions that James Sire is asking. And these are good questions, and again, they're not questions that I would come to a situation and as I'm hearing somebody's life experience and story, that I'm going to say, so question number one, what's the definition of prime reality for you? That's not the way I'm approaching that, but as a frame of reference in my own thinking, I would like to know that. I know that in my own thinking, I want to know, as that person is relating their life story to me over the course of my relationship building process with them, that I want to know how they explain the essence of reality, how they explain what external reality is comprised of. Is it just the physical universe, or is there a spiritual component to external reality? And then what is a human being then? In light of what you describe as really real and as the nature of reality, external reality to you, what's a human being? I want to hear that described in the way they tell their story and the way they live it out. And so that ultimately, having the desire to, at least for them to give entrance to the possibility that there's another story that may better explain and answer the questions that ultimately all people, I believe, are asking. And James Sire contends that they are indeed asking these questions that, man, around the world, when we run into cultures around the world, people, when they die, when people are sick and when they die, that there are lots of deep-level questions being asked. That people are fearful, by and large. There's a fear of there being a spiritual aspect to life that they don't fully understand, and they're trying to decide how to engage with that in an appropriate way, based on the sense of human identity and what there may be in terms of a soul that exists. And the common question asked. And then, why is it possible to know anything at all? Another question, how then, on the basis of these things, on the basis of reality, external reality, human identity, our ability to know anything at all, then how do we really know what's right and wrong anyway? If all we have is a closed naturalistic system, if all there is the material, the matter in the box of our interaction in life, then how can we define anything right and wrong? How does the story that's being told by a group of people or another person, how does it explain the existence of good and evil, of right and wrong? It's a question that people are asking. And you'll find people asking and certainly answering as you interact with them. Another question that James Sire mentions is the meaning of human history. What is the meaning of history? Is history headed in any kind of a direction, or is it just playing itself out in, let's say, an evolutionary process? Where is it headed? Are we headed towards a higher state of consciousness? Some of the pantheistic Western or non-Western kinds of cultural settings would head us toward a higher state of consciousness. And so, what is the meaning of human history? And then James Sire, and we talked about this in our conversations over that snack there, that what are the personal and life-orienting core commitments that are consistent with the worldview that we profess to hold to? This is where the rubber meets the road for a lot of us as Christians. You know, when I wake up in the morning, is my first thought, what's the cricket score? Or or what's, or what does God have for me today in my life? What's God's desire for me today? And those are significant, not necessarily cricket, so maybe a really significant event right now, religious event No, but seriously, we ask ourselves the questions in core commitments. How does my life manifest the things that the assumptions that I claim to profess in these other kinds of questions? So, if I truly describe prime reality as the existence of God, His person that created all things, and that external reality is comprised of the world as God made it, which includes both the spiritual and the material, and that human existence is based on creation in God's image, and that we know things because God is the all-knowing one and the source of truth, and that souls exist in human life because God created man as a spiritual being, and that right and wrong is derived from the authoritative communication of God, and therefore that human history has meaning according to what God has purposed. Therefore, the personal, life-orienting core commitments that are manifest for me should be derived, I trust, from that sequence of worldview. And that's of course our challenge, as I've said, as believers, that we live in light of the commitments that we're making, that we have made, and other people as well.
That it has to be solved. There's a dilemma.
Yeah.
That would seem to be probably closest to that. Like we would say, the issue seems like a lot of people with different worldviews see that there's something wrong, and it has to be fixed. And what solutions?
Yeah. What's the source of salvation?
Yeah.
So different worldviews would bring different sources of salvation to that. And in the scientific system, the solution to the wrong is if we just have enough good science, we can solve the problem. A lot of disillusioned people around the time First and then Second World Wars, especially in the U.S., quite quite a crisis existentially for people in their identities, because the science that was supposed to solve all the problems was creating atomic bombs that were not helping the human condition and situation. So, and James Sire, in fact, describes some of the ways in which that futility of the means of salvation in that area created nihilism and other points of view. But yeah, I'd say certainly the meaning of human existence in light of how do we solve this dilemma of difficulty in life, suffering in life, difficulty in life experience. What is providing for a source of salvation for us? So I think probably we aren't, and I've had the privilege and advantage of growing up in second cultural situations where I've been probably obliged to do more evaluation. I remember even as a young person referencing my parents' culture, which would have been the one I would be closely identified with, but to some of the things that were going on in the local cultures and thinking about the differences and having to reflect on that even at a fairly young age. But I think all of us, nonetheless, whether we've grown up in that kind of situation or not, it behooves us to be evaluative, to be reflective, and to reflect both on our own assumptions. Are we really consistent in holding to the core commitments of life that we describe based on the worldview that we claim to be a part of? And then in turn, are we willing to engage in an evaluation of life with others? Are we really willing to put our minds to work in that way? And as we connect with the stories of people around us, even from other cultural backgrounds, are we willing to really help them evaluate well the place where they're coming from? And we think, I don't have the right maybe to impinge on someone else's point of view in that way, but it's our privilege and part of what we describe as the incarnational process, that we have the obligation to lovingly help people to evaluate and consider the alternatives to the life that they're living and the place where they're heading, what commitments they're making, and to help them to see some of the inconsistency of that. I don't maybe just mention a few of these briefly. Christian theism is the Christian core that we would I trust hold to. Deism is the idea, that's why there's a clock here, and I didn't create all these slides, by the way. There was help given in this, but deism, the idea that there was a creative being who created the universe and then wound it up and let it spin like a clock. And he's not actively involved in the processes of regular day-to-day existence in a meaningful way. And progressively, as Western society has developed, you see a progression that if God isn't super involved anyway in day-to-day life, then we might as well live as if God doesn't exist. We might as well live as naturalists, because practically speaking, all there is the material that's in the box. And so we're stuck in a material box, and that's the way we need to live. We need to live out life commitments that represent all that there is in the box, which is very difficult to do. It's very difficult to actually live as if there's no transcendent standard of right and wrong. Ravi Zacharias tells a story of dealing with an atheist in the audience and saying to the atheist, if I brought a child up here, and obviously it's not something he would do, but if he brought a child up here and killed somebody on the stage, would that be abhorrent to that atheistic person who's coming from a naturalistic frame of reference? And the person has to concede that emotionally and emotively, they would react to that as offensive. But why? Why would that be offensive anyway? What creates the offensive nature of it? And the person at the end of the day he insisted on defending the fact that he didn't have the moral ground to call it either right or wrong. It would just bother him emotionally. And that is the place where a naturalist has to end up. That either right and wrong is some sort of a socially negotiated issue, and ultimately that means that there's a relativism to it that doesn't allow us to define it adequately well according to any sort of a transcendent standard. And that's where a lot of our society tries to live in core commitments, but practically very difficult to live out. So one of the systems that we have privilege to challenge as we go through our day-to-day life. And then there are some others here that I don't want to take a lot of time with. Postmodernism, probably just as a reference point for us in our societies, at least in the United States, the idea that we have the right to live kind of clustered away in our version of right and wrong, and in the meantime we can't judge anyone else's. So as long as we keep to ourselves in our definition, we don't have the privilege of judging anyone else's, because the relative standard of it makes theirs just as right as ours, that sort of thing. But you could interact more with these if you look at those resources that I mentioned, those books, but also the Access Truth. We describe those in quite a lot greater detail. So what we've done then is we've given a definition of worldview, and then we've described some of those, just briefly introduced some of the formal categories of worldview, and tried to create a model that we could reference. It starts with story, and it works itself out towards the actions or the external behavior that are a manifestation of that story. Any questions at this point? Anyone that strikes your attention or thought that you'd like to talk about or ask? Do you see, do you find challenges in relating what we're describing to your situations? In other words, the people that you're interacting with, are there areas where what we've talked about doesn't seem to relate to what you're dealing with really? How do I relate this to the people that I'm encountering in my day-to-day situations? Any questions about that? How is this really relevant, related to what I'm doing, where I live, who I interact with? Do you feel that to be a challenge, that the challenge of engaging with people in a more significant way? Is that something that is a new level of challenge? Or is that something that you'd seem to already be doing, by and large? It's a challenge for me, I'll say. So, there's nothing wrong with calling it a challenge. And from different, as we see the ways that those 7 questions are answered in different of these worldviews, lots of times as we're talking with a person, we can see how they're connected to one or the other of those. Some of the formalized systems, like deism or Christian theism, probably hopefully not to the same degree, but deism, naturalism, some of those sound like these neat systems that practically we don't know how they work themselves out in our lives. And so in this second resource, these authors try to identify these themes or threads of life that are persistent in our Western societies that affect us, and we don't think about them very much. Like individualism, for example, that I'm the one in the middle of life. I'm the one that is at the center, and so I need to make sure that my interests are served in the process of life being worked out. I think that in American society particularly, that's very common. It probably here as well, I would assume. Not here. It's a sacrificial, serve others kinds of a system here. Yeah, that's what I've seen. Yeah. Oh yeah. No, but that's one of the areas where, as we I've sat with believers from other cultural backgrounds and appreciated their way of approaching communal life more than ours, because their identity in community is more biblical than the one that we come from. That they see a sense of importance in working together in community, and that the community is more significant than that single individual. Whereas in most of our backgrounds, the individual is king. And as long as my rights are served appropriately, then everything's good. But if they get violated, then I have something to complain about. And consumerism is branding. I just think of branding in the U.S. And even my life as a believer, If if I have the choice to shop at the Gap or Old Navy, I mean, and those may not be stores you're familiar with, but I know which brand is better. And so I know what brand will speak more to American society. If I wear a Nike's or the cheap brand that Walmart sells, and my kids know too. They know that if they wear a watch that says Casio on it versus the one that says whatever, the $10 watch from Walmart or whatever. I mean, there's a consumerism that speaks volumes about our priorities, even as Christians. And we get very quickly caught up in that same mentality of consumerism that doesn't derive from a careful foundation of worldview that James Sire is describing as Christian theists, and yet very, very much a part of what we do and who we are as Westerners. And we communicate that attitude in turn to others in other parts of the world. We communicate our superiority through many means, whether it's individualism, consumerism, or this. And this is, I've watched a couple of BBC shows lately, and it's interesting to see the portrayal of Americans in those. They're very, seems like just across the board, they're really loud and annoying. And you laugh because that's your perspective probably too. The ugly American, right? Oh, really? Oh, yeah. That's the Australian in Bali? Oh, yeah. Yeah. But yeah. So, but this is in American society, and I think the nationalistic identity seems to be, I've heard people describe it as growing here to be stronger. In American society, there's a political and Christian connection. So, strong Republican politics is what we would define as, the right to keep and bear arms, anti-abortion, which I'm happy with that. Conservative political ideas, so anti-unions, which there's this set of platform planks that gets built, and then Christian is part of that. So you add that all up, so you end up with a person like Donald Trump, who lost the Christian somehow, but he got all the rest of it, and he wish he was quite a lot distance from me. But and the hair to boot. I mean, come on, what's going on there? No, but this really, you probably would see the American portrayal as representing this. I mean, and I would agree with that we've aligned our Christian identity with nationalism in an unhealthy way. But I think these categories do help us at least to think through the values that are associated here that we buy into without much reflection, and that people around us will buy into as well, and that people will be pursuing, that you'll find that people come here as citizens of another country to pursue some of the values that they see represented in our national system that aren't ultimately going to be based on an appropriate story. They're going to be based on consumerism or whatever else that is a benefit. That we're going to engage with those stories and try to redefine and redirect people to an allegiance that's not about our particular national system. And some others here that we've mentioned indirectly with comment from James Sire. So I think I probably will.
What's the one we can't see?
Yeah, that's salvation by therapy. I don't know if that's very common here. Salvation by therapy. The authors made the tongue-in-cheek comment, "Not as good as it gets," which is there's a movie reference there that I haven't seen. Yeah. So salvation by therapy, but in the U.S. there is a very psychologized also Christianity that creates a category of mental health and the ability to be redeemed through mental health resources that's not very closely connected with biblical truth. So it creates kind of a dichotomy, a false dichotomy between psychological health, mental health, and spiritual health. So you can grow to be redeemed through becoming psychologically healthy without there being a deep-seated spiritual change that realigns your core commitments, if that makes sense. I don't know if that would be very common here or not.
So is that what's being offered by non-Christian psychotherapists?
Yeah. and even Christians to some extent. I mean, we think about biblical counseling, and I've appreciated some of the threads of biblical counseling that I've personally had opportunity to engage with in the church in Denton. But there are those who've brought the psychotherapeutic model in and made it such a foundation to counseling that the biblical definitions and descriptions get lost in the process. So as you hear the description, all you're hearing is the psychological language that's borrowed in from the outside, rather than continually challenging that language and saying, how would the Bible describe that? What are the categories in terms of the Bible uses to talk about that? And what's the inherent problem that the Bible is describing when we talk about that issue in secular psychological terms? So I think that's the challenge for us, is to continue to find the biblical reference points that represent how the Bible defines those problems that are relegated oftentimes to this psychological camp that exists as a world in and of itself. And in the American church, it's certainly a problem. I know we're at about the time we've described here, I think. As closing, any concluding thoughts and questions? I'm going to jump through some of the images here. This was one of our key ideas, that we wanted to create a sort of a framework or model for ourselves that we can refer back to, that helps us to understand how worldviews are constructed from stories out to actions. And we gave a definition for worldview in that process. And then we described how that God has given us an alternative narrative that gives us opportunity, as we get to know the life stories of others, to challenge with an alternative view of life that answers ultimately those key questions that James Sire described for us in a more coherent way, and is more consistent in the way that it relates to our life experience. Any final thoughts or questions? Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging with me, for talking with me. I appreciate that. I didn't want to just sit up here and talk endlessly, so I'm glad you're asking questions and thinking through these issues. May the Lord give us wisdom and engagement with the people around us.